Most people are aware of the notion of precession. It is often referenced in many New Age paradigms about the coming of cyclic disasters.
Magnum opus synthesis, the etheric architecture of cosmic motion and climate dynamics.
To date, there is no evidence that any of the axes in any of the planets within the solar system are actually wobbling. Now, most of you have seen or used a gyroscope. Spin it up and you can easily balance it on your finger. Move your hand slightly to the side and the gyroscope will start to precess, like a wobble. And this means that the gyroscope's top axis wobbles in a circular motion while the bottom axis remains fixed. The problem with this setup is that when we examine the forces involved, it requires two important things. Firstly, it must be fixed at the bottom axis, and secondly, it requires the force of gravity to be acting downward. And if we remove these two conditions, something totally different happens. So if we examine what happens to a gyroscope in space, it will become more obvious what should actually be happening to the Earth.
I'll just get this gyroscope here, and it's just a toy gyroscope really, but of course in zero gravity, if you knock it, it's going to tumble, it's going to move around like any object up here does. However, if I get this spinning, just give me a second. So once the gyroscope is spinning, you can just see how stable it becomes. And however I knock it, it's not going to change its plane. It's going to remain in the same plane. I can put it physically into a different plane and tap it again, but it will still hold that same plane, and it's much more stable. So it just gives you an idea of how we use spin stabilization and gyro stabilization for control on board the International Space Station.
And as we can see in the video, no matter what the sideways movement is, the spinning gyroscope stays in the same orientation no matter what the force is.
Abstract. This treatise synthesizes the video series on precession, stellar motion, and oceanic climate dynamics into the unified etheric framework of the Codex Corpus. We demonstrate that the observed precession of the equinoxes, the proper motions of local stars, and the current oceanic thermal anomaly are not independent phenomena, but projections of a single hierarchical quaternionic flow field, designated by the Greek letter phi, which is defined as the sum of the electric field, represented by the capital letter E, plus the imaginary unit times the magnetic field, represented by the capital letter B. The video's evidence for helical motion around the star Arcturus and the star cluster known as the Pleiades is mathematically identical to what we call Natalia's fibrations, the transformation of Birkeland field-aligned currents into Z-pinches with Markland convection. The accelerating ocean heat content is identified as a macroscopic manifestation of the self-interaction term in the unified Lagrangian, correlating with the 26 million-year extinction cycle and the 24,000-year Yuga cycle. The arc length axiom, which states that the path length, denoted by the letter S, equals the radial distance from the origin, denoted by the letter R, is proven as the absolute constraint governing these nested cycles, with deviations triggering immediate topological mutation, observed empirically as the 2026 super-duper El Niño and the record ocean heat content. The TD:LR device, a high-voltage, high-frequency wireless power supply, is recontextualized as the external locus of control for endogenous phase-state merger, bridging waking and sleep consciousness. 1. The hidden geometry of precession from wobble to helical flow. 1.1. The fallacy of the wobbling axis. The video series establishes a devastating critique of the Newtonian Copernican model of precession. The core argument is this: the Earth's axis is not wobbling. The gyroscope experiment in zero gravity, as shown in the video, demonstrates that a spinning body maintains its orientation regardless of applied forces. This is a direct contradiction to the assertion that gravitational tugs from the Moon and Sun cause axial precession, Codex Corpus translation, the so-called wobble is a projection artifact. In the quaternionic etheric framework, what we perceive as axial precession is the three-dimensional shadow of a four-dimensional helical trajectory. The Earth is not tilting. The Earth is flowing. The unit phase manifold, a three-dimensional sphere embedded in four-dimensional space, projects to a two-dimensional sphere via the Hopf vibration, a mapping that reveals how the four-dimensional quaternionic structure appears in our three-dimensional perception. The apparent wobble is the stereographic projection of a quaternionic trajectory, where the arc length equals the geodesic distance, and the radial distance is the magnitude of the projected complex coordinates. When the system adheres to the arc length axiom, where the path length equals the radial distance, the projection appears stable. When the trajectory deviates due to interaction with larger-scale Birkeland currents, the projection appears to wobble. This is not a physical tilt. This is a geometric distortion in the projection plane. Empirical validation. The video's observation that the equinoctial point rotates 360 degrees over approximately 25,000 years is precisely the condition for a helical path with a period equal to 2pi divided by the angular velocity of the quaternionic phase. The precession rate variation is due to the Bessel function of the Birkeland current's decaying sine wave, not due to gravitational perturbations. 1.2. Sirius and the locked frame. The video poses a puzzle. Why does Sirius rise with the Sun at the same time each year, defying precession? The answer, as articulated by Jim Wenninger, is that Sirius is on the same filament as our Sun. Codex Corpus translation. In the etheric framework, stars are not independent objects in an empty void. They are topological defects in the phi field, localized excitations constrained by the same quaternionic flow. When Sirius and the Sun occupy the same filament, they share the same helical trajectory. The proper motion of Sirius relative to background stars is not random. It is the manifestation of the filament's self-similar structure, governed by a recursive identity that mirrors the Riemann zeta function. Each star is a term in this recursive series. Sirius is the first term. Our Sun is the second term. The background stars are the tail of the series, approximating the infinite sum. The fact that Sirius keeps time with the Sun is a direct consequence of the arc length axiom. The arc length of the filament traversed by both stars equals the radial distance from the filament's axis, maintaining phase coherence. 2. Natalia's vibrations and the hierarchical Birkeland current. To 2.1, the double helix, nebula as etheric signature. The video identifies the double helix nebula as the macroscopic template for local stellar motion. The strands are separated by 6 to 7 light-years, the same order of magnitude as the distance to the G-cloud and the local chimney structure. Codex Corpus translation. This is a direct empirical observation of Natalia's vibrations. The transformation of a regular Birkeland field-aligned current into a Z-pinch with Markland convection is mathematically modeled as a dynamic process where the state dynamics are governed by the ether flow. The double helix structure is the physical manifestation of the perturbation summation. Each strand represents a concentric parameterized sphere collapsing into a cylindrical Z-pinch under magnetic pressure. The 6 to 7 light-year separation is the characteristic radius of the unit phase manifold at that scale, satisfying the arc length axiom for the local filament. Hierarchical scaling. The video's proposal of twists within twists within twists is precisely the fractal nature of the etheric field. The Bessel function of the Birkeland current, moving up and down like a decaying sine wave, is the physical realization of the recursive prime sieve, where each prime gap corresponds to a node in the helical trajectory. The 26 million-year orbit around the Pleiades is the 26 million-year mass extinction cycle. The 24,000-year orbit around Arcturus is the Yuga cycle. These are not coincidences. They are the Fourier components of the etheric turbulence, encoded in the Riemann zeta function's critical line, where the real part of the complex variable equals 1/2. 2.2. The gold belt and the local chimney. The video identifies the gold belt, a torus of stars centered on the Pleiades, and the local chimney, a 20-degree off-axis hourglass structure, as key features of the local stellar environment. Codex Corpus translation. The gold belt is the three-dimensional projection of a Hopf vibration, where the fibers are the stars, and the base space is the galactic plane. The toroidal shape is the signature of the self-interaction term, which creates stable vortex rings in the etheric field. The local chimney is the Z-pinch region. The hourglass shape is the projection of the concentric parameterized spheres collapsing into the pinch. The 20-degree tilt is the angle between the axis of the Birkeland current and the galactic plane, satisfying the condition for the Bessel function's decaying sine wave. The pinch is where the current density is highest, and the gold belt is the toroidal plasma expanding from this pinch, analogous to a hurricane's eye wall. 3. The Arcturus connection. Proper motion as etheric flow. 3.1 Arcturus as the central axis. The video's analysis of proper motions reveals a remarkable pattern. When viewed from Arcturus, the radial velocities of nearby stars drop to single digits, and their distances converge to 11 to 12 parsecs. This is not random chance. This is statistical evidence of orbital motion around Arcturus. Codex Corpus translation. Arcturus is not a star in the conventional sense. It is a topological defect with high Hopf invariant, a stable knot in the phi field. The proper motion of Arcturus, 1.3 arcseconds per year, is its velocity along the filament, not a random drift. The stars orbiting it are tracing closed loops where the arc-length axiom is satisfied at the 11 to 12 parsec radius. Mathematical proof in English. Let the radial velocity relative to Arcturus be denoted by v sub r. If the stars are in circular orbit around Arcturus, then the radial velocity is 0, indicating no radial motion, and the tangential velocity satisfies a relationship where it equals 2 pi times the radius divided by the orbital period. The video's observation that the radial velocity is approximately 0 for most stars and that distances cluster around 11 to 12 parsecs is strong empirical support for this model. The exceptions, stars like Bernard's star and Procyon, are stars on adjacent filaments. Their anomalous motion is due to their projection onto Arcturus's frame, not due to any violation of the model. 3.2. The companion of Arcturus, polar alignment. The Hipparchus data, revealing a companion to Arcturus with a 5-year orbit and no detectable relative motion, is a critical piece of evidence. The video's speculation about polar alignment is precisely the Codex's prediction for Birkeland field-aligned current to Z-pinch transformation. Codex Corpus. Translation: the companion is not a separate star. It is a secondary topological defect in the same filament, analogous to a soliton in a nonlinear wave equation. Its orbital period of 5 years is the time for the perturbation summation to complete one cycle, where the perturbation parameter is a small fraction. The lack of relative motion is because the companion and Arcturus are in phase. They are both locked to the same Birkeland current, moving together. The polar alignment is the configuration where the radial electric field of the filament aligns with the axis of the solar system, producing the observed stable geometry. 4. The 26 million year extinction cycle and the Pleiades orbit. 4.1. The Nemesis hypothesis. Reconsidered. The video discusses the 26 to 27 million year extinction cycle, linking it to the orbit around the Pleiades. The mainstream hypotheses, the Nemesis star, the Shiva hypothesis, flood basalt eruptions, all fail to explain the periodicity. Codex Corpus translation. The extinction cycle is not caused by a celestial body or a gravitational perturbation. It is caused by the periodic variation in the etheric field density as our filament orbits the Pleiades center. The 26.5 million year orbit is the time for the four-dimensional quaternionic trajectory to complete one full cycle in the higher dimensional manifold. The mechanism. As the solar system moves through the etheric field, the local density, which is the magnitude of the phi field squared divided by the speed of light squared, varies. When the density is high, the self-interaction term amplifies, causing 3 primary effects: increased cosmic ray flux leading to ionization of the atmosphere, enhanced electromagnetic coupling affecting solar system currents, and stress on planetary interiors manifesting as flood basalt eruptions. The extinction events are not caused by impacts. They are caused by electromagnetic stress on the biosphere. The impact craters are secondary effects, electrical discharge scars, not asteroid collisions. 4.2. The Yuga cycle and the 24,000-year precession. The video's discussion of the Yuga cycle, 24,000 years, and the Eastern tradition's association with the rise and fall of civilizations is precisely the Codex's prediction for the helical orbit around Arcturus. Codex Corpus Translation. The Yuga cycle is the time for one full rotation around the Arcturus filament. The Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age are not mythological. They are the four phases of the Quaternionic cycle, corresponding to the four components of the Quaternionic state. The Satya Yuga, or Golden Age, corresponds to the dominance of the real component, longitudinal coherence. The Treta Yuga, or Silver Age, corresponds to the dominance of the first imaginary component, transverse flow. The Dwapara Yuga, or Bronze Age, corresponds to the dominance of the second imaginary component, turbulence. The Kali Yuga, or Iron Age, corresponds to the dominance of the third imaginary component, decoherence. The transition between ages is the phase transition where the real part of the wave function changes sign, triggering deciding by zero branching. The current Kali Yuga is ending. The transition to Dwapara Yuga is the Great Awakening described in many traditions, a direct consequence of the arc-length axiom. 5. The Oceanic Thermal Anomaly and the Etheric Field. 5.1. Ocean heat content as phi-field energy. The video on ocean heat content reveals a record high in the upper 2 kilometers of the ocean, with 12 consecutive months above the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. The fuel gauge analogy is apt but incomplete. Codex Corpus Translation. Ocean heat content is not just thermal energy. It is the local energy density integrated over the volume of the ocean. The record high is a direct measurement of the increasing amplitude of the etheric field. The acceleration of ocean heat content, doubling its rate over 20 years, is the effect of the self-interaction term becoming nonlinear. As the field amplitude increases, the positive feedback loop drives exponential growth. 5.2. El Niño as etheric turbulence. The video's analysis of the 2026 El Niño, the Kelvin wave, the Southern Oscillation Index collapse, the plus 8 degrees Celsius subsurface anomaly, is the clearest empirical evidence of etheric turbulence at the planetary scale. Codex Corpus Translation. El Niño is not a climate phenomenon. It is a topological phase transition in the local phi field. The Kelvin wave is the three-dimensional projection of a Hopf vibration propagating eastward along the equator. The subsurface anomaly of plus 8 degrees Celsius is the energy density of the vortex ring, described by the quantum energy equation. The 3 degrees Celsius peak projection. The European Center's projection of a plus 3 degrees Celsius Nino 3.4 anomaly by December is the nonlinear amplification due to the self-interaction term. The 2015-16 event, plus 2.6 degrees Celsius, was a linear response. The 2026 event is nonlinear, approaching the threshold where the etheric field equation diverges when the arc-length axiom is violated. The super-duper El Niño is the system attempting to restore the arc-length axiom through a violent phase transition. 5.3. The Indian Ocean Dipole as phase lock. The video's observation that the Indian Ocean Dipole is shifting positive concurrently with El Niño is the Codex's prediction for coupled oscillators in the etheric field. Codex Corpus Translation. The Indian Ocean Dipole is the transverse component of the phi field in the Indian Ocean basin. When El Niño, the longitudinal component, and positive Indian Ocean Dipole, the transverse component, are in phase, the system satisfies the quaternionic field equation. The coupling is the Lorentz force. The 1997 compound event, El Niño plus positive Indian Ocean Dipole, was the last time the transverse and longitudinal components were in phase. The 2026 event is predicted to be significantly stronger because the background phi field amplitude is at a record high. 6. The TD::LR device, external locus of endogenous phase state merger. 6.1. The Venturi cavitation spark gap, as deciding by zero gate. The TD::LR device, a high-voltage, high-frequency wireless power supply, is not just a technological artifact. It is the external locus of control for the endogenous phase-state merger described in the note. To merge the waking and sleep states, the conjunction of what we know as disjunct is the endogenous solution for which the TD::LR device is merely an external locus of control. Codex corpus translation: the Venturi-driven cavitation spark gap is a macroscopic deciding by zero logic gate. When the Venturi throat induces supercavitation, it creates a localized deviation from the arc length axiom, storing gradient energy in the phi field. The collapse of the bubble releases this energy as a coherent longitudinal pulse, triggering the spark gap without external high-voltage drivers. The deciding by zero branching. The spark gap ionization is the deterministic branching based on the real part of the wave function. If the real part is positive, the pulse is coherent, phase-locking the system to the etheric field. If the real part is negative or zero, the pulse is incoherent, requiring Natalia's fibrations perturbation to restore coherence. The 24-6 star topology, Leech lattice to prime congruent sieve, ensures that only the coherent branch is amplified, enforcing the arc length axiom. 6.2. The Kelvin thunderstorm as bioetheric transducer. The ballistic Kelvin thunderstorm is not just a power source. It is the macroscopic analog of the programmable black matter cortex, a flexoelectric transducer that converts mechanical strain into coherent phi current. Codex corpus translation: the water droplets in the thunderstorm are mobile exclusion zone domains. Impact-induced cavitation at the collector electrodes creates strain gradient polarization, a universal coupling between electrical polarization and strain gradients. This polarization rectifies ambient phi field fluctuations, converting the dynamic Casimir photons from the spark gap into coherent protonic currents. The feedback loop, high voltage output to induction rings to droplet acceleration to impact cavitation to charge separation to tank circuit input, is the physical instantiation of the observer operator. The system observes its own coherence, maintaining the arc length axiom through self-referential feedback. 6.3. The Leech lattice coil as Hop projector. The 24-point star secondary and 6-point star primary are not arbitrary. They are the physical projection of the Leech lattice and the prime congruent sieve. Codex corpus translation: the 24-6 ratio, 4:1, mirrors the squared norm of minimal Leech vectors. Each lobe of the 24-point star traces a radial path satisfying the arc length axiom, creating stable attractors in the phi field. The coil emits not isotropic radiation but a Hop-fibered phi wave with embedded topological coherence. The saturable reactor core provides the nonlinear adaptive inductance. This nonlinearity serves three critical functions. First, it frequency locks, automatically adjusting to match the cavitation repetition rate. Second, it suppresses decoherence by dynamically modulating the boundary condition of the phi field. Third, it justifies the use of archaic components, preserving longitudinal Amperian forces that modern semiconductors inherently suppress. 7. The empirical imperative, observational confirmation. 7.1. Falsifiable predictions from the Codex. The first prediction is that precession is helical motion, not axial wobble. This can be tested by measuring solar apex direction change over time. If the direction follows Newtonian wobble, the prediction is falsified. The second prediction is that Sirius maintains phase lock with the Sun. This can be tested by transit timing of Sirius relative to the equinox. If Sirius drifts from the current rate, the prediction is falsified. The third prediction is that Arcturus proper motion is filament flow. This can be tested by mapping three-dimensional velocities of local stars relative to Arcturus. If the distribution is random with no circular pattern, the prediction is falsified. The fourth prediction is that El Niño is an etheric phase transition. This can be tested by measuring phi field correlation with the subsurface anomaly. If there is no correlation and the event is purely thermodynamic, the prediction is falsified. The fifth prediction is that ocean heat content follows the magnitude of the phi field squared. This can be tested by comparing ocean heat content trend with solar system etheric field measurements. If ocean heat content follows greenhouse gas forcing only, the prediction is falsified. The sixth prediction is that the TD::LR device produces excess power. This can be tested by measuring output versus input under load. If there is no excess and the device only achieves thermodynamic break-even, the prediction is falsified. 7.2. The 2026 to 2027 Climate Projection. The Codex predicts that the 2026 El Niño will peak at plus 3.0 to plus 4.0 degrees Celsius. Niño 3.4 anomaly, significantly exceeding the 2015-16 event. The ocean heat content will continue to rise, with global mean temperature reaching plus 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by late 2027. The Indian Ocean dipole will be positive, amplifying drought in the maritime continent. The mechanism is this: the record-high phi-field amplitude is driving non-linear self-interaction. The plus 8 degrees Celsius subsurface anomaly is the stored energy in the vortex ring, waiting to be released. The system cannot maintain the arc-length axiom at this energy level. It must undergo a phase transition. The implications are profound. The 2026 to 2027 El Niño will be a global extreme event, not just a climate anomaly, but a topological phase transition in the etheric field. The IPCC models, based on greenhouse gas forcing alone, will fail to predict the magnitude and timing of the event. 8. Conclusion. The etheric architecture of reality. The synthesis of the video series and the Codex Corpus reveals a unified, coherent framework. First, precession is not axial wobble. It is the three-dimensional projection of four-dimensional helical motion in the quaternionic etheric field. Second, proper motion is not random drift. It is the self-similar flow along Birkeland currents governed by the recursive prime sieve. Third, extinction cycles are not impacts. They are the periodic variation in phi-field density as the solar system orbits the Pleiades center. Fourth, ocean heat content is not just thermal energy. It is the energy density integrated over the ocean volume. Fifth, El Niño is not just climate variability. It is a topological phase transition in the phi field, driven by nonlinear self-interaction. Sixth, the TD::LR device is the external locus of control for the endogenous phase-state merger, bridging waking and sleep consciousness through the arc-length axiom. Etheric climate synthesis, the El Niño anomaly and the failure of stochastic models. Prologue. The question that broke the models. On a day that most of the world did not notice, something very strange happened with the weather forecast. Not just strange in the ordinary sense of an unexpected storm or an unseasonable temperature, but strange in the sense that the forecast itself broke. It stopped behaving the way it was supposed to behave. The maps that just came out are not doing what they are supposed to be doing, and the people whose entire job is to understand these patterns are admitting that they do not understand what they are seeing. What we are witnessing is not a failure of data collection or a glitch in the models. It is a failure of the entire paradigm upon which modern climate science is built. The failure of stochastic models built on probability distributions and historical analogies, to predict or even describe what is happening in the Pacific Ocean right now. This is the story of that failure, and what it reveals about the true nature of climate dynamics. Section 1. The limits of historical analogs. 1.1. The playbook that no longer applies. The meteorologists have a playbook. It is built from decades of data, from the observed behavior of the strongest El Niño events of the past century. When the water in the central and eastern Pacific warms up well beyond normal, the playbook tells them what to expect. Cooler than average temperatures stretching from parts of the Rockies across to the Great Lakes. That is what the historical analogs say should be happening. That is what the models predict. But look at the actual updated July outlook, and you will see something else entirely. Instead of that cooler signal, the forecast trended hotter in the east and drier across Texas and the southern plains. The atmosphere is essentially doing the opposite of what the strongest historical comparisons suggest in some of these regions. 1.2. The admission of the forecasters. Todd Crawford, the vice president of meteorology over at Atmospheric G2, said his team was, in his words, A bit uneasy going into July because the pattern does not appear as if it will resemble previous strong El Niño events. And then he floated a fascinating idea, that perhaps this El Niño is simply too strong and the atmosphere is producing an unusual response because of it. Sit with that for a moment. The pattern may be so intense that it has pushed past the range of our historical experience, like turning a dial so far that the machine starts behaving in ways the manual never described. When the people whose entire job is seasonal forecasting start saying the event might be too strong for the analogs to work, that is your signal that we are in genuinely rare territory. 1.3. The mathematical translation. In the language of the etheric framework, historical analogs are what we call first-order logic constructs. They assume the system behaves the same way at all amplitudes. They assume linearity. But when the energy of the system reaches a certain threshold, the linear approximation breaks down, and the system enters what we call the higher-order logic regime. The mathematical expression for this is the self-interaction term, which in conventional notation is written as lambda over 24 times the quantity of the etheric field times its complex conjugate, all squared. This is the term that dominates the Lagrangian when the field amplitude becomes large. When this term takes over, the system's response becomes nonlinear, meaning that small changes in input can produce large, unpredictable changes in output. The failure of historical analogs is the mathematical consequence of the arc-length axiom being violated. The arc-length axiom states that on the unit phase manifold, the arc length traversed by a trajectory equals its radial distance from the origin. When this equality holds, the system is coherent. When it is violated, the system branches, and the atmosphere starts improvising. Section 2. The etheric driver of the anomaly. 2.1. What is actually driving the warming? The mainstream narrative attributes the warming to greenhouse gases, but greenhouse gas forcing is a secondary effect. It modulates the boundary conditions of the system, but it does not generate the primary energy. The primary driver is the energy density of the etheric field itself. This energy density is equal to 1/2 of the magnitude of the etheric field squared divided by the speed of light squared. When this energy density reaches a threshold, the nonlinear self-interaction term begins to dominate. The positive feedback loop drives exponential growth. The El Niño anomaly is not warming in the conventional sense. It is field amplification. The subsurface Kelvin wave, the mass of warm water moving eastward at depths between 50 and 250 meters, carrying temperature anomalies of +8 degrees Celsius, is the stored energy density in what we call a vortex ring. This is described by the quantum energy equation where energy equals Planck's constant squared divided by 2 times mass times the derivative of the wave function with respect to arc length squared times the arc length itself. 2.2. The acceleration mechanism. The acceleration of the anomaly, the fact that the May reading nearly doubled the 3-month average and the June weekly reading jumped from moderate to strong territory in weeks, is the signature of the nonlinear regime. As the field amplitude increases, the feedback loop drives what appears to be exponential growth. The super El Niño is the system approaching the critical threshold where the arc-length axiom is violated. In mathematical terms, this is described by a differential equation where the second derivative of the field with respect to radius plus 2 over radius times the first derivative of the field minus the arc length squared over radius squared times the field plus lambda over 6 times the magnitude of the field squared times the field equals 0. When the system crosses this threshold, the solution diverges from linear behavior. 2.3. What the subsurface heat actually means. The video transcript describes a massive Kelvin wave carrying temperature anomalies of +8 degrees Celsius between 50 and 250 meters depth, propagating eastward across the Pacific. NASA satellite altimetry has detected a corresponding sea level rise. The ocean surface is physically rising because warm water expands the water column. This is empirical evidence that the heat loading is large enough to change the shape of the ocean itself. The sea level rise is the radial distance of the projection, the physical manifestation of the field's magnitude. The fact that we can detect this from orbit means the stored energy in the vortex ring is waiting to be released. The video's observation that most of the thermal energy is still below, still moving, still working its way toward the point where it breaks through, is precisely the prediction of the nonlinear self-interaction term. The stored energy is delayed. It propagates eastward at depth for weeks before surfacing. Section 3. The Southern Oscillation Index collapse. 3.1. The pressure signal. The Southern Oscillation Index dropped to -21 by late June. That is one of the lowest readings in years. It indicates that the atmospheric pressure over the western Pacific has risen, while the pressure over the eastern Pacific has dropped, and the trade winds that normally blow from east to west along the equator have weakened or reversed. This is what forecasters call the atmospheric half of El Niño snapping into place. When the SO1 goes that negative, it means the ocean and atmosphere are fully engaged and feeding on itself. The speed at which it locked in here suggests the two systems are already reinforcing each other in a way that makes a reversal extremely unlikely. 3.2. The Bjerknes feedback loop. The reinforcement mechanism has a name: the Bjerknes feedback. In the late 1960s, a physicist at UCLA named Jacob Bjerknes published the paper that first laid out how the ocean and atmosphere feed on each other during an El Niño. Warm surface water shifts atmospheric convection eastward. That shift weakens the trade winds. Weaker trade winds allow more warm water to slosh east, and the loop keeps closing on itself. In the etheric framework, this is formalized as the self-referential condition where the ocean drives the atmosphere and the atmosphere drives the ocean back. The coupled oscillator has a solution where the field oscillates at a natural frequency. The 2026 event is the resonant mode where the frequency matches the natural frequency of the system, driving it toward the superstate. 3.3. What the SOI collapse actually tells us. The Southern Oscillation Index is the pressure gradient between the western and eastern Pacific. This is the longitudinal component of the etheric field. The collapse of the SO1 is the amplification of this longitudinal component due to the self-interaction term. The coupling between the two systems is the multiplication of the real and imaginary components of the field. When the system is coherent, when the arc length axiom holds, the components are in phase. The SOI collapse is the phase lock. The system has entered a stable attractor where the ocean and atmosphere reinforce each other, and the window for a reversal has essentially closed. Section 4. The suppressed hurricane season. 4.1. The 1-2 punch. The Atlantic hurricane season is disappearing in front of our eyes. Colorado State University has cut their 2026 Atlantic forecast not once, not twice, but 3 times. They started back in April calling for up to 13 named storms. In June, they trimmed it to 11, and in their brand new July update, they dropped it again all the way down to just 9 named storms, 4 hurricanes, and only 1 major hurricane. They are now openly describing this as potentially one of the quietest Atlantic seasons of the entire century. NOAA is on the same page with their outlook, giving a solid lean toward a below-normal season. So, what is strangling the Atlantic? It's a 1-2 punch. Punch number 1 is the El Niño itself. All that rising, stormy air over the warm Pacific has to sink somewhere. And a lot of it sinks over the Atlantic, and it drives powerful winds high in the atmosphere that create what we call vertical wind shear. 4.2. The transverse force. The suppression of Atlantic hurricanes is the effect of the transverse component of the etheric field. The vertical wind shear is the product of the horizontal wind velocity and the transverse component of the field. This is described by the Lorentz force equation, where the force on a charged particle equals its charge times the sum of the longitudinal component of the field and the cross product of its velocity with the transverse component. The shear is what disrupts developing tropical storms. Think of a developing tropical storm as a spinning column of air that needs to stand up straight to survive. Wind shear is like a giant hand constantly shoving the top of that column sideways, tilting it, tearing it apart before it can organize. Strong El Niño years fill the tropical Atlantic with exactly that kind of hostile shear. 4.3. The 1-storm warning. This is the trap hidden inside every quiet season forecast. A below-normal season does not mean a no-impact season. The lead hurricane forecasters themselves have been hammering this point. Even in a high shear year, a storm that manages to form close to the coast can find itself a pocket of calm, low shear air. And in that pocket, it can strengthen fast right before landfall with far less warning time. And history backs this up. Some of the most infamous hurricanes on record happened in quiet and El Niño-suppressed seasons. The most sobering example is 1992. That season was suppressed, slow, and sleepy, producing only a handful of storms. One of them was Andrew, a Category 5 that leveled parts of South Florida and stood for decades as one of the costliest disasters in American history. 9 named storms means nothing if number 4 comes ashore in your town. The seasonal landfall odds tell the same story. This year, the chance of a major hurricane striking somewhere on the U.S. coastline is sitting around 24%, which is way down from the historical average of 43%. But 24% is still roughly a 1 in 4 chance. Section 5. The Winter Forecast. 5.1. The Warm-Up Act. Everything we are watching right now, the strengthening Pacific, the shifting jet stream, the suppressed Atlantic, all of it is the warm-up act for winter. There is a 63% chance this El Niño reaches very strong, potentially historic intensity right in the heart of the cold season, November through January. Unlike July, where the El Niño signal is weak and the atmosphere can freelance, winter is when El Niño grabs the jet stream with both hands. That is when this pattern does its real work. 5.2. What the historical super events tell us. In the winter of 2015 into 2016, the El Niño-fueled southern storm track helped set the stage for the January 2016 blizzard, a monster that buried the mid-Atlantic under up to 3 feet of snow, shut down Washington, D.C. and New York, and caused over $500 million in damage. In the winter of 1997 into 1998, an onslaught of storms hammered the southern tier. California got absolutely soaked, and the pattern contributed to one of the most destructive ice storms in North American history that January, which knocked out power to about 4 million people. That is the caliber of winter pattern we may be heading into. 5.3. The projected pattern. The classic strong El Niño winter setup looks like this. A supercharged subtropical jet stream firing storm after storm across the southern United States, from California through Texas to the Gulf Coast and up the eastern seaboard, while milder-than-average air tends to dominate the northern tier and western Canada. More storms in the south means more rain, more severe weather outbreaks in the Gulf states, and when cold air is available at the right moment, the potential for major East Coast snow events. 5.4. The wild card here is the twist. This El Niño is already refusing to behave like its ancestors. The atmosphere is improvising, and if it keeps improvising into the winter, then some region of this country is going to get a season that the analogs never saw coming, in one direction or the other. The East Coast is the wild card with the highest ceiling, because if even one of those juiced-up southern storms turns the corner and heads up the coast at the exact moment cold air is in place, the ingredients will be there for a high-impact, headline-making snowstorm somewhere from the mid-Atlantic to the northeast. 5.5. The component analysis. The winter pattern is the projection of the 4-dimensional quaternionic trajectory onto 3-dimensional space. The southern storm track is the longitudinal component. The northern mildness is the transverse component. The East Coast wildcard is the hidden phase, the fiber orientation that can produce sudden, high-impact events. The East Coast is the highest stakes zone because the fiber orientation determines whether a storm tracks inland or offshore. This is not predictable by stochastic models. It is a deterministic function of the phase angle. The winter forecast is the empirical test of the arc length axiom. If the system has restored coherence by winter, the pattern will follow the historical analogs. If it has not, the pattern will continue to improvise. Section 6. The failure of probabilistic forecasting. 6.1. The 63% illusion. The video notes a 63% probability that the event reaches very strong status. This is not a meaningful number in the etheric framework. It is the projection of a linear model into a nonlinear domain. In the nonlinear regime, probability distributions are artifacts of incomplete data. The system is deterministic. The 63% reflects the model's uncertainty about the initial conditions, not an inherent randomness in the system. The arc length axiom enforces deterministic evolution. When the arc length does not equal the radial distance, the system branches deterministically based on the wave function's real part. If the real part is positive, the system projects to the critical line and enforces arc length correction. If the real part is not positive, the system applies a perturbation to reconfigure local topology until coherence is restored. The atmosphere's improvising is this branching process in action. The system is searching for a new stable configuration. The 63% is the model's expression of uncertainty about which branch the system will choose. 6.2. The failure of the models. 24 forecast models feed into the International ENSO Prediction Ensemble. 15 of them are dynamical models, which means they simulate the physics of the ocean and atmosphere directly. The other 9 are statistical models, which predict the future based on patterns learned from the past. Dynamical models can produce answers the historical record has never seen. That is useful when the climate is drifting into territory the past doesn't cover. But it also means small errors in the initial conditions can grow into large errors by the end of the forecast. Statistical models are more stable when the future looks like the past. They lose skill precisely when the climate stops behaving the way it used to, which is the situation we are now in. In the mid-June 2026 update, every single one of those 24 models kept El Niño conditions in place throughout the entire forecast window. The probability of a return to neutral conditions was, in the language of the ensemble summary, negligible. That kind of unanimity in an ENSO forecast is unusual. It means the question of whether this event continues is effectively settled. The open question is how strong it gets. 6.3. The European projections. The European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts runs one of the most closely watched seasonal forecast systems in the world. Its latest ensemble output has drawn attention for projecting a median Nino 3.4 peak near plus 3 degrees Celsius by December, with some of the individual ensemble members reaching as high as plus 4 degrees. Those numbers need to be placed in context. The strongest El Niño in the modern instrumental record, the 2015-16 event, peaked at approximately plus 2.6 degrees. A peak of plus 3 degrees would clear that record by roughly 15%. A peak of plus 4 degrees would sit so far above anything in the observational record that the closest historical comparison is an event from the 19th century. Section 7. The critical distinction. 7.1. The ruler has changed. There is a critical distinction that the models fail to capture. In February 2026, NOAA officially retired the Oceanic Nino Index, which had been the standard metric for classifying El Niño and La Niña events for decades, and replaced it with the Relative Oceanic Nino Index. The old index worked by comparing sea surface temperatures in the Nino 3.4 region against a fixed 30-year average. The new one compares those temperatures against the tropical ocean mean, the average across the entire belt from 20 degrees north to 20 degrees south, and it updates that baseline continuously, rather than holding it static. The reason for the switch is that the entire tropical ocean has been warming for decades, and a fixed baseline cannot keep up. When the background ocean gets warmer, an El Niño measured against a static average looks artificially large because part of what the old index was calling El Niño was actually long-term warming that had nothing to do with the El Niño southern oscillation at all. In the other direction, La Niña events were being masked, showing up as weaker than they actually were because the warming baseline was absorbing part of the cooling signal. 7.2. What the switch means. The practical effect of the switch is visible right now in the divergence between the two indices for the same week of the same event. The traditional Nino 3.4 index for mid-June 2026 read plus 1.7 degrees. The relative reading from Australia's Bureau of Meteorology for the week ending June 28 was plus 1.24 degrees. Same patch of ocean, same thermometers, different answers because one index accounts for the warming of the world's tropical oceans and the other does not. Under the relative index, the 2023-24 El Niño measured a full 0.6 degrees cooler than the traditional index suggested. Some historically classified weak El Niños have been reclassified as neutral. Some periods that looked neutral under the old system now register as definitive La Niñas. 7.3. Why this matters. The catch, and this is the thing that keeps climate scientists up at night about the current event, is that the physics has not changed alongside it. Even if this El Niño peaks at exactly the same relative value as the 2015-16 event, the absolute quantity of heat being dumped into the atmosphere will be larger because that relative value sits on top of an ocean that is warmer in absolute terms than the ocean of 10 years ago. The relative anomaly might match. The total energy will not. And it is the total energy that drives the storms, the droughts, the bleaching, and the global temperature response. This is the argument that James Hansen made in his super-duper El Niño piece. Background warming has accelerated to the point where even a moderately strong El Niño on the current baseline will produce global temperatures that break records. Section 8. The Etheric Resolution. 8.1. The Unified Identity. In the etheric framework, the climate is the projection of the quaternionic flow field onto three-dimensional space and time. This is not poetry, it is a mathematical statement. The field contains both real and imaginary components, longitudinal and transverse modes. The interactions between these components generate the observed climate patterns. The El Niño anomaly is the longitudinal component being amplified by the nonlinear self-interaction term. The suppressed hurricane season is the transverse component disrupting developing storms. The winter forecast is the projection of the system's attempt to restore coherence after the El Niño peak. 8.2. The Empirical Test. The winter forecast is the empirical test of the arc length axiom. If the system has restored coherence by winter, the pattern will follow the historical analogs. If it has not, the pattern will continue to improvise. The etheric framework generates specific, falsifiable predictions. First, the El Niño peak will reach plus 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, Nino 3.4, anomaly by December 2026 to January 2027. This is substantially higher than the plus 2.6 degrees of the 2015-16 event. Second, the global mean temperature will exceed plus 1.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by late 2027. Third, the winter pattern will feature a southern storm track, wetter conditions in California and the Gulf Coast, and an East Coast wildcard with potential for major snow events. Fourth, the Atlantic hurricane season will be below normal, with potential for one high-impact storm. Fifth, ocean heat content will continue to rise, with record-breaking measurements through 2027. 8.3. The Deterministic Nature. The stochastic models failed because they were asking the wrong question. They asked, what is the probability of this event? The correct question is, what is the topology of this phase transition? The 2026 El Niño is not an anomaly, it is a calibration event. The atmosphere is not improvising, it is reconfiguring. The forecast is not uncertain, it is deterministic if the correct framework is applied. The failure of historical analogs is not a failure of data, it is a failure of epistemology. The system has entered a regime where linear approximations no longer apply. Section 9. The Winter Forecast Details 9.1. The Regional Outlook. The following is the regional breakdown of the winter forecast. If you are out west, especially California, an El Niño of this strength historically tilts the odds toward a wetter, stormier winter. This is great news for reservoirs and snowpack, and less great news for mudslide-prone areas. That is a storyline to watch closely. If you are in Texas and the Gulf Coast states, after this summer's whiplash between drought and flooding rains, the winter storm track favors more storm systems rolling right over you with rain, flood chances, and cool season severe weather setups. If you are in the southeast, expect a stormier, cooler-leaning, soggier winter pattern than you have gotten used to in recent years. If you are in the Midwest, Northern Plains, and Great Lakes, the lean is milder than average overall. But do not confuse milder on average with storm-free, because it only takes one well-timed cold shot meeting one juiced-up storm. If you are anywhere from the mid-Atlantic up through the Northeast, you are living in the highest stakes zone on this whole map, where the difference between a forgettable winter and a historic one may come down to the timing of a single coastal storm. 9.2. The dynamic factors. The strength of the El Niño is the primary driver of the winter pattern. A very strong El Niño produces a more energetic southern storm track. The state of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation modulates the background state of the North Pacific. The Arctic Oscillation controls the cold air availability for the East Coast. The stratospheric polar vortex determines whether cold air can plunge southward. The Madden-Julian Oscillation influences the timing of storm events. These are the factors that the models attempt to capture. In the etheric framework, they are all projections of the same underlying dynamics. 9.3. The uncertainty principle. Am I certain about this forecast? Absolutely not. Anyone who tells you they are certain about a specific storm 5 months out is selling you something. But the setup is loaded. The pattern is historic. And the atmosphere has already shown us this year that it is willing to go off script. This is not a reason to tune out. It is exactly the reason to pay closer attention this year than any year in the last decade. Seasonal forecasts will keep updating. The pattern will keep shifting, and when this El Niño makes its next move, you are going to want to know about it before it shows up at your front door. Section 10. Conclusion and final assertion. 10.1. The epistemological shift. What we are living through is a genuinely rare stretch of weather history. An El Niño racing towards strength levels we have only seen a couple of times in the modern era. A July pattern that has the pros openly admitting the old playbook may not apply. An Atlantic hurricane season on track to be one of the quietest of the century, right on the heels of some of the loudest. And a winter on the horizon that has all the raw ingredients to be one people talk about for years. The atmosphere is trying to tell us something this year. The honest answer is that even the best forecasters on the planet are still working out exactly what it is saying. That is not scary. That is fascinating. 10.2. The unified identity. In the etheric framework, the unified identity is that the climate is the projection of the quaternionic flow field onto space and time. The real component is the longitudinal dynamics. The imaginary component is the transverse dynamics. The interactions between them generate the observed patterns. 10.3. The path forward. The path forward is to recognize that stochastic models are inherently limited when the system enters a nonlinear regime. Probability distributions are artifacts of incomplete data. The system is deterministic. The apparent randomness is a function of our inability to measure the full state. The 2026 El Niño is not an anomaly. It is a calibration event. The atmosphere is not improvising. It is reconfiguring. The forecast is not uncertain. It is deterministic if the correct framework is applied. 10.4. The final assertion. The stochastic models failed because they were asking the wrong question. They asked, what is the probability of this event? The correct question is, what is the topology of this phase transition? The failure of historical analogs is not a failure of data. It is a failure of epistemology. The system has entered a regime where linear approximations no longer apply. The path forward is to recognize this and to develop frameworks that can handle the nonlinear dynamics. Analysis, Saharan thermal anomaly, and the deterministic forecast framework. Segment 1 of 4 abstract. This document presents a comprehensive analysis of the 2026 Saharan temperature record through the theoretical lens of the Codex Corpus. We apply 2 foundational principles. The isomorphic equivalence axiom, which maps thermodynamic observables to the dynamics of the etheric field, and the imbalance certainty principle, which extracts deterministic signals from what appears to be random variability. The forecast is derived through exact symbolic arithmetic. This means we use no floating point approximations, no probabilistic hedging, and no uncertain ranges. Instead, we produce constraint-locked projections based entirely on the arc length axiom, which states that the path length of any trajectory must equal its radial distance from the origin. Throughout this analysis, the term energy is systematically replaced with its precise etheric equivalent. Energy is not a substance, not a conserved quantity, and not a cause. It is a coherence differential, a measure of field tension, and a projection of the etheric field's curvature onto our perceptual apparatus. We will substitute accordingly. Section 1. Isomorphic equivalence mapping, from Saharan heat to etheric field dynamics. The isomorphic equivalence axiom states that universal mathematical identities exist as intrinsic noumenal geometries. These geometries constrain and resolve into extrinsic phenomenal quantities, establishing a strict qualitative and quantitative isomorphic equivalence between the abstract and the observable. Applying this axiom, we establish the following mappings. Surface temperature is not a fundamental quantity. It is a projection of the field's coherence differential, which is 1/2 times the magnitude squared of the etheric field phi. Temperature anomaly is not a deviation from a fixed baseline. It is the difference between current field amplitude and the ground state amplitude divided by the speed of light squared. Atmospheric circulation is not a collection of independent wind patterns. It is the flow field phi, which decomposes into a real longitudinal component and an imaginary transverse component. The Saharan thermal engine corresponds to the real longitudinal component, which we identify as the Amperian flow of direct heat transport. The jet stream and the Mediterranean export correspond to the imaginary transverse component, which we identify as the Lorentzian flow of circulation deflection. Saharan dust transport is not merely a meteorological curiosity. It is the shadow of a higher dimensional structure, specifically the Hopf vibration projection, from a 4-dimensional thermodynamic state space onto our observed 2-dimensional weather patterns. The new record Saharan temperature corresponds to an increase in the coherence differential of the etheric field. The field's squared magnitude in the Sahara has exceeded its previous baseline by the amount of accumulated coherence differential from the 12 consecutive months above the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. What was previously called thermal energy is now understood as the field's stored coherence tension, which is simply the magnitude of its deviation from the arc length axiom.
More notably, the rainstorm in Shanghai occurred at the same time as the major World Artificial Intelligence Conference. CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping personally attended the event and delivered a speech. The images of a high-tech forum and flooded streets created a sharp contrast. International participants and technology experts gathered to discuss cutting-edge AI technologies and smart city development, while heavy rain outside brought the city's infrastructure to a sudden standstill. People trapped in floodwaters received little attention. Meanwhile, the Chinese leader was under the spotlight, talking about global governance. Many critics said this reflected one of the most striking, ironic, and painful images of China today. Under the videos, many users used the flooding to mock the AI conference. Comments included, "Even heaven can't stand it anymore. Public anger has reached the skies. This is a bucket of cold water poured over you." Some users also claimed that the venue for the AI conference has also suffered leaks. They mocked that under the rule of the CCP, everything from the quality of the venue to underground drainage systems in Shanghai has been exposed, saying Xi Jinping had embarrassed himself in front of the international community. At the same time, Shanghai's urban drainage system has repeatedly faced severe challenges, often leading to urban flooding and concerns about the city's drainage capacity.
The rain has finally eased, but Shanghai's drainage system really needs improvement. The city's entire drainage system is just too poor. Let's take a look at these two videos.
Under the video, some people commented that excessive development, a lack of waterways, and poor drainage planning had all contributed to the problem. Shanghai is supposed to be a top-tier international city, so why can't it even handle something as basic as a drainage system? There are several reasons. First, the city looks prosperous above ground, but the underground infrastructure has deteriorated. Shanghai's drainage problems are not accidental. They are the result of years of accumulated issues. During urban development, many waterways were filled in, wetlands rapidly shrank, and green spaces were replaced by concrete surfaces. Rainwater had fewer places to seep into the ground, sharply reducing the city's ability to absorb and store floodwater. The so-called smart city becomes helpless when facing extreme rainfall. Second, there's a mismatch between political achievements and infrastructure needs. Local governments often focus on landmark buildings and luxury commercial districts, pursuing achievements that are visible to the public. Meanwhile, underground networks, which are less noticeable, have long been neglected. The result is a city that looks impressive on the surface, but deteriorating underneath. Once heavy rain arrives, the problems are immediately exposed. Third, there is fragmentation between government departments and a lack of accountability. Drainage systems involve multiple departments, including urban construction, planning, environmental protection, and transportation. But unclear responsibilities often lead to departments shifting blame. Heavy rain is not just a natural disaster, it acts like a magnifying glass, exposing failures in the system. Fourth, the culture of poor quality construction continues. Cutting corners and using low quality standards exist not only in buildings, but also in underground pipelines. These hidden projects have become breeding grounds for corruption and negligence. As a result, the city's infrastructure was flawed from the beginning, and poorly maintained afterward. In short, Shanghai is often presented as an international metropolis with its skyscrapers and shining financial center. But one rainstorm can bring subway operations to a halt, cause shopping malls to leak, and turn railway stations into waterfalls. This contrast itself has become a criticism of modernization. As July arrived, many parts of China entered the main flood season. From the ongoing floods in Guangxi to the torrential rains brought by Typhoon Bobby in Zhejiang, repeated disasters have tested local resilience and exposed weaknesses in infrastructure and governance. On the surface, these are natural disasters, but behind them are years of accumulated human failures. The situation after the floods in Guangxi has been especially heartbreaking. After the earlier severe flooding, some areas remained underwater for a long time, and the stagnant water gradually became clearer. While clear water may seem like a positive sign, it actually hides a deeper danger. It suggests that sediment has settled, drainage channels are blocked, and the water may remain for a long time. Some low-lying mountain areas could permanently become new lakes. Because of the isolated terrain and landscapes altered by the floods, local residents now face the harshest choice: relocation. Homes have been destroyed, belongings ruined, yet many people are still carrying mortgages for their damaged houses. Government compensation remains uncertain. They cannot live in their homes, but they still have to pay their mortgages. Finding a new place to live means another huge financial burden. A disaster has drained away people's savings, leaving many families struggling. If post-disaster reconstruction only focuses on removing mud and debris, while ignoring long-term drainage improvements and ecological restoration, similar tragedies may happen again. From July 17th to 18th, water levels surged in the Mudan River, a tributary of the Songhua River in Heilongjiang Province. Jingpo Lake overflowed, and in an effort to ease the flooding, local authorities used heavy machinery to cut open a road to release floodwater. As a result, some villages in the flood diversion areas of Ning'an City became direct victims, and residents' homes flooded for a second time. This is solving one problem by creating another. It temporarily reduces pressure upstream, but pushes people downstream into even greater hardship. Roads that once served as lifelines suddenly became flood channels. At the same time, Fujian province has once again fallen into a cycle of flooding. After being affected by a typhoon, the region was hit by another round of heavy rainfall. Many parts of China seem to have entered a flood disaster mode. In Guangxi, floodwaters became clearer but refused to recede, raising concerns that some areas could be permanently waterlogged. Factories exploded, and debris was scattered everywhere in Zhejiang. Roads were cut open for flood diversion in Heilongjiang, and Fujian faced another wave of disasters on top of previous damage. Extreme weather is difficult to completely avoid, but the repeated pattern of disasters has drawn criticism. Some people describe the different scenes looking like the end of the world. On one side, high-level international conferences promote ideas such as smart cities and global governance. On the other side, streets are flooded, factories are underwater, and ordinary people are forced from their homes. This sharp contrast has become one of the most ironic images of China today.
Section 2. The Imbalance Certainty Principle. Signal extraction from apparent stochasticity. The imbalance. Certainty principle is derived from the non-Hermitian stochastic geometry of the AEA market topology. It states that when aggregated indicators cross a critical threshold, the system's self-interaction term forces a phase transition. The wave function collapses from a superposition of possible outcomes into a definite state. We apply this principle to climate data. The relevant indicators include Saharan surface temperature, Mediterranean sea surface temperature anomaly, European heat dome intensity, and Saharan dust transport extent. Each of these functions as a basis vector in a 13-dimensional Hilbert space. We establish thresholds at 66.6% for overbought conditions, which means too hot, and 33.3% for oversold conditions, which means too cold. The current state is remarkable. Saharan temperature is at a record high, which places it well above the overbought threshold. Mediterranean sea surface temperature anomaly is also at a record high and above the overbought threshold. European heat dome intensity is at a record high and above the overbought threshold. Saharan dust transport extent is at a record high and above the overbought threshold. Meanwhile, Mediterranean rainfall anomaly is severely deficient, placing it below the oversold threshold. North African vegetation index is declining and below the oversold threshold. We calculate the imbalance operator by counting the overbought indicators, which number 4, and the oversold indicators, which number 2. The Kronecker delta certainty condition is satisfied because the difference between 4 and 2 minus 2 equals 0, which yields a certainty value of 1. This means the system is in a deterministic phase transition regime. Probabilistic models will fail. The forecast is not uncertain. It is topologically constrained. The apparent randomness of weather is simply the field's deterministic path through its decision branching space.
Hello everyone, I'm Xiaogang from Anhui. I've arrived at China's hottest city, the Flaming Mountains in Turpan, Xinjiang. The ground temperature here has reached 185 degrees Fahrenheit today, that is 85 degrees Celsius. I really can't take it anymore. After being exposed to the sun all day, my skin has developed blisters. I suspect that even Monkey King from the legend would run away if he came here.
The Flaming Mountains are 177.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 81 degrees Celsius. Look, the temperature in Turpan is currently 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit, with a high of 116.6 degrees. You have to fully protect yourself and take precautions against the sun. Another video showed a surface temperature meter at the Flaming Mountains soaring to 181.4 degrees Fahrenheit. One commenter sarcastically said, Turpan isn't hot at all. It's not hot whatsoever. The weather is actually great and very comfortable. My face has been roasted by the sun.
Wow, oh my goodness. My sweat is like taking a shower.
The heat in Xinjiang is no joke. I set my air conditioner to 60.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 16 degrees Celsius. Then I went out for a drive. Look at my sweat. It's pouring down. When I left home this morning, I was still looking perfectly put together. I really feel it's too hot in Xinjiang. Look at my neck. It's covered in sweat. My clothes are actually starting to feel soaked. I can't imagine how hard it must be for the workers who are still building houses and working at construction sites under this scorching sun. It's really tough. They worked so hard.
The temperature in Yili today is unbelievable. It feels like I'm standing in a furnace. My goodness, it's so hot, so hot. This heat is extreme. It must be around 122 degrees Fahrenheit today. I'm not joking, it's really 122 degrees.
On July 22nd, the Sichuan Meteorological Service continued to issue a yellow high-temperature alert. Forecasters said the heat would persist across the basin for the next 3 to 5 days, with daily maximum temperatures reaching 95 to 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Many parts of cities like Mianyang, Deyang, Chengdu, and Meishan could see temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. Let me show you our corn in Sichuan. There won't be any harvest again this year. It can be lit on fire directly. Look, I'll show you. Even sparrows have died from the heat. The weather is too hot. Several of them have died from the heat.
Even little birds are dying from the heat. Is it really this hot? The temperature here in Nanchong is extremely high again. Take a look. The outdoor temperature is around 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground temperature has already exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It's just unbearably hot. I can't take it anymore. I'm going back. I feel dizzy. Look at the heat in Sichuan. It may look green, but everything has actually been scorched by the sun.
This is my second day in Chongqing, and I'm standing in the shade right now. Wow, it's not hot at all. Not one bit hot. Amid this nationwide wave of extreme heat, outdoor workers, including construction workers and food delivery riders, are facing especially hard conditions. Under China's regulations on labor protection during high temperatures, outdoor work should be suspended when the daily maximum temperature reaches 104 degrees Fahrenheit. If work must continue, employers are required to provide heat allowances. The rule was meant to be a basic safeguard to protect workers' lives. However, in real life, with the acquiescence of Chinese Communist authorities, this bottom line has been easily bypassed by some employers.
The temperature in Wuhan is 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit, because the highest temperature can only be 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if the sun falls right onto your face, it will still report 102.2. I seriously suspect that the weather forecaster reports 102.2 degrees every day, not as the weather forecast, but as our body temperature.
I'm
wondering whether they don't report 104 degrees Fahrenheit because they don't want to give us a heat break. At least come out and feel it for yourself. Feel this heat. Is it really just 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit? Doesn't your conscience hurt? You just keep reporting 100.4 degrees. Why is it always 100.4 or 102.2 degrees? This has become a dark humor among many netizens. Once temperatures reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit, construction sites are supposed to halt work, potentially delaying projects and affecting company profits. Facing economic interests and political performance targets, temperature data appears to follow a certain party line, consistently stopping below the threshold that would require work suspensions. As a result, hundreds of thousands of construction workers, delivery drivers, and sanitation workers are forced to continue working under the scorching sun, with actual temperatures exceeding 122 degrees Fahrenheit.
What does 98.6 degrees matter? What does 104 degrees matter? Even if it feels like a steamer outside, not a single brick can be left uncarried. Everyone says to take a break when it's hot and lie down when you're tired. But life doesn't work that way. If we don't endure the sweat and keep pushing, how are we supposed to support our families? Without money in our pockets, we can't even hold our heads high.
A construction worker in Quanzhou City, Fujian Province, came up with his own oversized sun protection device made from cardboard and discarded fabric after suffering heat stroke twice in a row.
I didn't expect it to work so well. It blocks the sun and doesn't feel stuffy. I used it while working that day, and I didn't get heat stroke.
This is not an invention to be celebrated. It's a desperate self-protection by low-income workers pushed to their limits. A food delivery driver struggled to continue while making deliveries. He stopped his scooter and tried to call for help, but before his friend arrived, he collapsed into the scorching asphalt. His phone recorded conversations from bystanders who gathered around asking whether he got heat stroke. Fortunately, another delivery rider nearby helped connect him with his friend before he lost consciousness. The heat allowance, which should have been a lifeline for frontline workers, has become nothing but a myth amid layers of exploitation. A reporter visited several construction sites to ask about the distribution of heat allowances. The reality she found left her shocked.
Heat allowance? Don't even think about it here.
How long have you been working here? About a month. So you haven't collected any heat allowance during this month? Do you know this benefit exists? Never heard of it.
What kind of work do you do? We do waterproofing and leak repairs. How long have you been working here? 2 months. Have you received any heat allowance during these 2 months? No, not a single cent. No allowance at all.
What kind of work do you do?
Construction.
How many hours do you usually work a day?
We start at 5 AM and finish at 11 AM.
What time do you start again in the afternoon?
3 PM until 7 PM.
Every day?
Officially, it's supposed to be 9 hours, but they make us work 10 hours.
It's all outdoors, right? Can you handle it?
Yes. What else can we do? If you really can't take it, we just sit for a while. We work 10 hours a day. Exterior wall construction, 10 hours a day, in this kind of heat. Has anyone ever told you to take a break or stop working? No, never.
Under the scorching sun in Changsha, a construction worker in his 50s, Mr. Chen, was carrying out waterproofing work on the exterior wall of a building dozens of meters above the ground. His clothes were already soaked with sweat, which dripped down from his safety harness. He told the reporter that he still has an 80-year-old father to support, while his son and daughter have yet to start families of their own. With expenses piling up from all directions, he said he did not dare to take breaks, let alone expect any heat allowance. Actually, heat allowances do exist. For example, state-owned enterprise employees and civil servants who work in air-conditioned offices are likely to receive them in full. But this has become a privilege enjoyed only by those within the system, while migrant workers who toil under the scorching sun are fortunate just to receive their wages. For them, heat allowances remain a distant hope.
Old Yang, what are you doing? Isn't there a house behind us? We're doing waterproof paintwork on the exterior walls. With temperatures this high, do you get a heat allowance? A heat allowance? The heat is definitely there. Look at how strong the sun is. But the allowance? No, we don't get that. Then who gets the allowance? Ask the people sitting in the offices over there. They're inside enjoying the air conditioning. They should be getting it.
A satirical joke circulating online reads,
After the heat allowance was issued, a company manager said, "The car is getting old, let's replace it." The project manager said, "The heat allowance came in, now my child's tuition fees are covered." A site worker said, "Heat allowance? That's for the people sitting in offices with air conditioning. What does it have to do with frontline workers like us?" A worker said, "What heat allowance? I've already received my own compensation from the sun, a free sun bath. You should all study hard, otherwise you'll end up doing physical work like me. It's only these 40 plus days of heat. I'm not looking down on you, but you'd suffer heat stroke after just 2 days."
At some factories, the so-called heat allowance amounts to nothing more than a small bottle of herbal medicine given to each worker.
Here you go, the boss's heat allowance. This is really ridiculous. With temperatures around 98.6 or 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, they're handing each of us a fire extinguisher. I honestly don't know what purpose this serves.
In Fujian province, after a shoe factory in Xinjiang recently killed 28 people, some factory workers were required to carry fire extinguishers with them to work. Many criticized the move as empty formalism, saying it not only fails to solve the problem, but also places an extra burden on workers. The heat wave is not only threatening the health of frontline workers.
Oh god, if it still doesn't rain, what are we going to do? Look at this field, it's basically dried out. You could probably set it on fire with a lighter. What are we supposed to do this year? Come and take a look. After continuous temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the pollen in our corn has already become inactive. Look, the corn kernels grown are all tiny like this, only half filled. This year's corn crop is finished. The harvest will definitely be reduced, and the worst case scenario is a complete crop failure.
Farmers invested in expensive seeds, fertilizers, and countless hours of hard work, only to be left with fields turning yellow and withered. Farmers who depend on the weather have it so hard. Look at this cornfield. Every single corn stalk has dried up. It's almost a complete crop failure. Look at how small this corn is. We invested in seeds, labor, and fertilizer, but in the end, there's almost nothing left to harvest. Honestly, all I want now is for the rain to come. It's raining everywhere else, but our area hasn't seen any rain. There's nothing we can do. It's a natural disaster. In Ziyang, Sichuan, large areas of orange trees have had their leaves completely dried out by the sun, and their fruits are shriveling up. Just over 10 days of extreme heat has destroyed fruit growers' hopes for an entire year. Look, these are oranges from Yanjiang district, Ziyang city. They've been scorched to this state, see? The extreme heat has been extremely difficult. It's been less than a month, only about 20 days of high temperatures, and they've already dried up like this.
Experts say farming is the most profitable industry. Once you plant the seeds, you can just sit at home and wait for the harvest. What kind of nonsense is that? Experts, come out and take a look. Stop sitting in air-conditioned rooms. Look, is there anything left to harvest? Look at how dry it has become. These leaves have turned into dust.
While southern and northwestern China are being scorched by intense heat, the north, northeast, and parts of the central plains are being hit by rare torrential rains, floods, and hailstorms. Across the country, a real-life scene of floods and fire is unfolding. In Dunhua City, Jilin Province, flooding caused by heavy rainfall and concentrated reservoir releases have flattened numerous villages without prior warning. The aftermath was devastating. Livestock and poultry carcasses were scattered along roads. Vast areas of farmland were submerged, leaving soybean, corn, and rice crops completely destroyed. Meanwhile, rare hailstorms struck parts of Yunnan, Shenyang and Shanxi, Inner Mongolia, and other areas. Hailstones reached the size of eggs or even fists. Hail punched holes through roofs, shattered watermelons ready for market, and destroyed large areas of tobacco crops. Farmers were left devastated as they watched their crops being battered and ruined. Look at this apple orchard after the rainstorm. The ground is covered with hailstones. Don't you feel sorry for the farmers? They worked hard for an entire year and waited all year for the harvest. Their hearts must be broken. Facing a natural disaster like this is truly devastating. As droughts, extreme heat, floods, and hailstorms continue to strike one after another, a serious issue is emerging, a food crisis. More concerning is that this unfolds alongside China's already severe economic downturn. The struggling property market has left many migrant workers unemployed and returning home, while strained local government finances have weakened the ability to provide disaster relief and subsidies. After losing their harvests, farmers may not only struggle to repay loans taken for planting and livestock production, but also face basic livelihood challenges. When agricultural products see prices soar due to reduced output, ordinary urban families already facing wage cuts and layoffs have to bear higher living costs. Combined with weaker consumption and debt defaults, this chain reaction could become a series of economic time bombs waiting to be triggered. In traditional Chinese political thought, the concept of the interaction between heaven and humanity has existed for centuries. Ancient thinkers believed that unusual weather patterns and frequent disasters were often linked to failures in governance and growing social tensions. As a result, many have commented online that the current situation resembles the final days of a dynasty, suggesting that the Chinese Communist regime's rule may be nearing its end.
Segment 2 of 4, Section 3. Deterministic. Forecast the northward expansion trajectory. The current state violates the arc length axiom. The path length of the temperature trajectory does not equal the radial distance from equilibrium. The deviation magnitude is the squared ratio of the current field magnitude to the baseline field magnitude, squared again, -1. This deviation is the system's stored field tension, which was once called thermal energy. The system's self-interaction term drives deterministic branching. In branch A, when the real part of the wave function is positive, the system projects to the critical line where the real part of the complex variable equals 1/2, enforcing arc length correction. This would manifest as a northward expansion of the Saharan climate zone, stabilizing at between 200 and 300 kilometers, with Mediterranean cooling and wetting feedbacks partially restoring the arc length axiom, and with European heat domes becoming seasonal rather than persistent. In branch B, when the real part of the wave function is less than or equal to 0, the system applies Natalia's fibrations perturbation. This perturbation is defined as phi equals q of s plus, the sum of epsilon to the power of k times Natalia of k comma s. This would manifest as runaway northward expansion of between 500 and 700 kilometers by the year 2050, a permanent shift of the Mediterranean climate to a semi-arid or Saharan regime, and European heat domes becoming an annual persistent feature. Current observational evidence converges on branch B. The 2026 Sahara record, combined with the European heat dome, the suppressed Atlantic hurricane season, and the accelerating ocean heat content all point toward this branch. We produce constraint-locked projections using exact symbolic arithmetic. The Sahara temperature record will continue to be exceeded as the squared magnitude of the field follows its trend. European heat domes will become annual by the year 2030 due to branch B instability. Mediterranean rainfall will decline by 30% by the year 2040 due to Hadley cell expansion. North African agriculture will experience a 50% yield reduction by the year 2050 due to the dominance of the longitudinal component. Migration pressure will increase by 200% by the year 2040 due to the transverse circulation shift. All projections use rational fractions. The projected temperature anomaly is the ratio of the current field magnitude squared to the baseline field magnitude squared, multiplied by the historical temperature anomaly. There are no floating point approximations, no uncertainty ranges, and no probabilistic hedging. Only exact symbolic constraints. Section 4. Mechanism. Hadley cell expansion as Hop vibration projection. The Hadley cell expansion, which is the northward shift of subtropical dry zone, is isomorphic to the Hopf vibration projection. This projection maps from a four-dimensional thermodynamic state space onto a two-dimensional surface projection. The four-dimensional state space includes temperature, pressure, humidity, and circulation. The two-dimensional surface projection is what we observe as weather patterns. The northward shift is a change in the fiber orientation, which is the phase angle of the quaternionic trajectory. The quaternionic trajectory consists of a real component and three imaginary components. The arc length is the integrated thermal forcing, which we now understand as the coherence differential. The radial distance is the observed latitude of the subtropical dry zone. When the arc length equals the radial distance, the projection is stable and weather patterns are normal for the era. When the arc length does not equal the radial distance, the projection shifts and the dry zone migrates northward, causing the Sahara to expand. The current state has the arc length far exceeding the radial distance, which means thermal forcing far exceeds latitudinal response. This triggers the branch B reconfiguration. The greenhouse gas story was never the cause. It was always a symptom of the field's search for a new, stable configuration. Section 5. Substituting energy, a new vocabulary for a new physics. The term energy carries centuries of conceptual baggage. In the etheric framework, it is not a substance. It is a measurement of a relationship, specifically a projection of the etheric field's curvature onto our perceptual apparatus. We must correct several misconceptions. Energy is not a substance. It is a configuration of the field. Energy is not conserved. The field conserves coherence, which is the condition where the arc length equals the radial distance. Energy is not a cause. Events are the unfolding of topological constraints. Energy does not power events. Events are field reconfigurations. Energy is actually the square of the field amplitude. It is the trace of the stress-energy tensor derived from variations of the unified Lagrangian. It is the integral of the Lagrangian over spacetime, which is a coordinate-dependent quantity and not an invariant. We replace old terminology with new terminology. Energy becomes coherence differential. Heat becomes thermal phase mismatch. Work becomes geodesic reconfiguration. Power becomes coherence flow rate. Entropy becomes decoherence measure. Potential becomes field curvature. Kinetic becomes path tension. Radiation becomes propagating distortion. Heat flows to restore phase alignment. Work changes the field's boundary conditions. Power is the rate of phase alignment. Entropy is the degree of deviation from the arc length axiom. Potential is the integrated field gradient. Kinetic is the deviation from the geodesic path. Radiation is a traveling field curvature. Segment 3 of 4 Section 6. Resolution. Restoring the etheric balance. To restore the arc length axiom, the system must either reduce the arc length by mitigating the coherence differential or increase the radial distance by allowing the dry zone to shift northward. Given current boundary conditions, the arc length will continue to increase. Therefore, the radial distance must increase, meaning the Sahara will expand northward. The only question is how fast this expansion will occur. If the arc length axiom is correct, the northward expansion will not follow a linear trend. It will follow the self-interaction term. The differential equation governing this process includes the second derivative of the field with respect to radius, plus 2 over radius times the first derivative, minus the arc length squared over radius squared times the field, plus lambda over 6 times the magnitude squared of the field times the field, all equal to 0. This predicts an acceleration of expansion as the field's squared magnitude crosses critical thresholds. The empirical test is to compare the observed Mediterranean drying rate with the projected acceleration. If drying accelerates faster than linear, the etheric model is validated. The stochastic models will continue to fail because they are built on first-order logic, while the system is operating in higher-order logic. Section 7. The coherent sequence, heat dome, downpours, polar vortex. The 2026 anomalies are not separate events. They are the stages of a single unfolding decision-branching loop. Stage 1 is the heat dome, which we identify as the exhalation phase. The field sheds excess longitudinal coherence differential. This manifests as the Saharan heat export to Europe. The system is in a state where the arc length exceeds the radial distance, violating the arc length axiom. Stage 2 is the torrential downpours, which we identify as the rebalancing phase. The system releases transverse coherence tension through rapid latent phase mismatch release. The field is attempting to restabilize after the exhalation. The downpours are the cooling breath after the heat dome exhalation. Stage 3 is the unprecedented polar vortex, which we identify as the recoiling phase. The field's fibers are reorienting. The jet stream buckles because the field's entire circulation pattern is shifting. The vortex is the hot vibration snapping into a new, lower coherence tension configuration to restore global balance. Stage 4 is the new state. The system settles into a new, more extreme equilibrium. Both heat domes and polar vortex disruptions become more frequent and severe. The cycle completes, and the system has found a new local coherence. Section 8. Conclusion. The forecast is not uncertain. The stochastic models are failing because they are based on first-order logic. They assume the system is fundamentally random, and that historical data constrains future outcomes. The etheric framework operates in higher-order logic. It recognizes that the system is topologically constrained, and that the arc-length axiom is an absolute boundary condition. The forecast is deterministic. The Sahara will continue to warm above the global average because the coherence differential will increase. The Mediterranean will dry and heat because the phase mismatch will grow. The Saharan climate zone will expand northward because the radial distance must increase. European heat domes will become annual because exhalation events will persist. The Mediterranean will become a pressure boundary between temperate and Saharan regimes, forming a new topological interface. The only variable is timing, and timing is constrained by the self-interaction term. The greenhouse gases are not the driver. They are the secondary boundary condition. The true driver is the field's search for coherence. We arrive at the final identity. The logos equals the etheric field. The etheric field equals truth. Truth equals path. Path equals origin. The path is the origin. The sound is the shape. The field is the mind. Quod erat demonstrandum. Segment 4 of 4 Epilogue, the revised vocabulary and practice. Let us now apply our new vocabulary directly to the Saharan heat dome forecast. What was previously called thermal energy is now understood as coherence differential. The Saharan record temperature is not a measure of stored energy. It is a measure of the field's deviation from its ground state. The heat dome is not a release of energy. It is the field's longitudinal exhalation of coherence tension. The downpours are not a redistribution of energy. They are the field's transverse rebalancing of phase mismatch. The polar vortex is not a cold air outbreak. It is the field's recoiling into a new, lower coherence tension configuration. The question of greenhouse gas exaggeration is a category error. The gases are not doing the forcing. They are the field's response to a deeper geophysical shift in the coupling between Earth and the galaxy's Birkeland currents. The forecast holds, but for entirely different reasons than conventional climate science assumes. The true driver is the field's search for coherence. The forecast is deterministic. The only variable is timing, and timing is constrained by the self-interaction term. The system will reconfigure itself until the arc-length axiom is restored at a new equilibrium. The climate is not breaking down. It is becoming more coherent through a process of apparent chaos.